So thanks for having me. Just a little bit by way of my background, I have been a red teamer in one capacity or another over the past 25 years. Started my career in the DoD Intel community side of the house, and then have worked in the commercial sector, a lot of various organizations here listed. The lessons learned that I want to provide today are not technical lessons learned. They're more kind of theoretical or practice lessons learned. And I want to focus on them from the perspective of the red teamers actually engaging in the red team, and then a little bit on what the defenders can learn from the red teamer perspective, or how what we've done over the past 25 years applies to cyber defense in of itself. So dive right in. First rule from the lessons learned from red teaming over 25 years is asymmetry everywhere. And this is an interesting one because we're taught about balance in yin and yang, and that we're seeking balance of power, or we're looking for balance in the force, when really all of that is a farce. Adversaries seek asymmetry in a variety of different ways. And an adversary, or red team engagement is meant to seek out that asymmetry. Can you use $1 invested in cyber attack to thwart 100 million invested in cyber defense, right? We're seeking that asymmetry. We're seeking that imbalance. We're seeking that disproportionality. So it's important to remember that you keep that in context, that in everything that a red teamer is doing, they are seeking that asymmetry, whether it is in cyber red teaming or in more conventional type red teaming. OODA loop compression, or the ability to operate with agility. Always offer up the example of playing a game of chess. And would you rather play a game of chess where half of your opponent's pieces are taken from the board, or before the game is start, or you're able to do 2 moves for every move that your opponent can make? Very interesting perspective to kind of think about, what does it look like, or even if you're operating with half your pieces but you get twice the moves in something like chess, as well as in red teaming. Agility and being able to move at speed provides tremendous advantage. So we're seeking for that agility to take place, for you to be able to do this time compression and operate a lot quicker than the cyber defenders can. And when you think about this from a cyber defense perspective, time to detection, reducing dwell time, those are all objectives that we've seen, and I've heard them articulated throughout the day today as well, with regards to metrics for cyber defense. And when you can compress your OODA loop and operate faster, you as an attacker can demonstrate what can be accomplished in a shorter time frame. So perhaps being a little bit more aggressive, being maybe a little bit more noisy, but operating at a tempo that the cyber defenders are not going to be able to expect or anticipate. Don't place artificial constraints on yourself as a red team. I got my introduction into red teaming, as I mentioned, back in 1995, 96, as a cyber red teamer, but working with some conventional red teamers. And one of those is a gentleman named General Van Riper. And it was interesting that he would have these physical assets, these Jeeps and these tanks, that he would be given as part of his, red forces encountering the blue forces, which would be the US forces and some of our coalition partners. And he would do really unconventional things. He would use unconventional ships to launch attacks that were kind of suicide attacks. In one instance, he actually used aluminum foil and mylar balloons to make Jeeps look like tanks, and kind of migrated around, with a fainting position, and threw the adversary off, in his case, the blue forces. And I immediately remember that in one of those war games where he won through one of these, really outside the box type engagement models, they kind of called a halt to the war game and said, "Oh, wait, no, you're cheating. You can't do this." And he made a really strong argument saying you can't impose any artificial constraints on the red team that you can't also impose on the adversary. So when you have a client that is trying to say, don't operate your attacks, after 10 o'clock p.m. at night, or you can't engage in red team engagements on a specific date, you're putting constraints on the red team that don't exist for the real attackers. And that is a scenario in which the red team engagement is not going to be as fulfilling as it should be. So don't impose those artificial constraints, or, as General Van Riper said, the attacker, the adversary, has access to aluminum foil and mylar balloons. So it's not appropriate to say that he's sought unfair advantage by using those tools and those technologies as part of that red teaming engagement. There is no spoon. One of the companies that I ran for 7 years was called FusionX, and we did a lot of red teaming for the private sector. And we did it in a way that tried to emulate the adversary as closely as possible, or emulate the attacker. And we worked on red teams for 8 of the top 10 banks, the large social networks, the oil companies, telecommunication companies. We had this varied client base, and people would ask me, hey, what is the FusionX red teaming methodology? And I would quote this line from the Matrix, that there is no spoon. You need to provide your red teamers with that ability to kind of think on their feet and not be constrained into one particular methodology that says, when faced with X, do Y, when faced with Y, do Z, that makes them predictable. That plays very well into one of the other red team engagement tenets that I like to talk about, which is that the context is king with regards to how you portray what the red team is going to do on a particular engagement. I was guilty of this earlier in my career, where I would give briefings to boards of directors and CEOs, and we would have conducted at the time, red team, where we would run some tools and we would show the work that we had done, and we'd say, hey, we have found 100 high-level vulnerabilities and 200 medium and 300 low risk. And you would provide that as that was some sort of contextual metric for them. And it is, in one sense, with regards to just raw discovery. And then the next engagement, maybe you come in and say, okay, well, we have 75 high level vulnerabilities instead of 100. And the boards would inevitably ask, does that mean that our security has improved? And that becomes a bit of a loaded answer, because on one hand, perhaps it has, but on the other hand, maybe it has not. The things that they are trying to protect the most, the information or the systems that are most valuable in that organization, possibly haven't improved in security. Maybe you've limited some of the attack surface, but you might not have eliminated the attack surface that is most contextual for that organization. So being able to go in and say, we know that you are a financial institution, and the threat model that you're most concerned with is sophisticated organized crime trying to engage in financial fraud. So for this red team engagement, we replicated the tactics, techniques, and procedures of a cyber organized crime entity. And here is the attack surface that presented itself. Here is the decisions that we made when attacking your network in order to achieve our objective to steal money or engage in fraud. Here is where your defenses failed or didn't live up to the expectations that you had set with them. And then here is the impact that took place. And that last piece, the impact component, is incredibly important, that they understand what is the real business impact of this red team engagement on my organization. Were you able to access systems that would allow you to steal money? At FusionX, we were relatively famous for operationalizing our attacks. We would steal money from banks. We would actually move it outside the financial institution as part of the red team. We would access intellectual property. We would access PII, but then do a simulated exfiltration of that PII with large encrypted kind of dummy data sets. And for those that work in the space, you understand the complexities around not wanting to exfiltrate real PII. We would demonstrate to the CEO of the oil company that you could cause oil to spill on the ground in a mock refinery using all of the equipment that you would find in one of their refineries, using only a cyber attack. And what happens now is that the executives and the leadership are actually able to understand what the impact to the business is as a result of that cyber attack. One example I often like to cite is briefing the board of directors for a Fortune 10 company. And the Fortune 10 company board had written a list, and it was the 10 biggest risks to the organization. And Cyber attack was number 7 on their list. So there were 6 things that they had prioritized as security risks to the organization that were ahead of cyber risk. I asked the board for, examples. I said, give me 3 scenarios in which something happens in the business that would be catastrophic. It would impact potentially the survivability of the business, or consequential. And by consequential, I meant something that you would have to file on your quarterly report because it was significant and impactful enough. And they gave 3 things that could happen in the business that would meet those criteria. And then the next red teaming engagement, I went and worked with the chief information security officer to engage in a red team that accomplished all 3 of those objectives using cyber only attacks. As you can imagine, the next time that the board met and they were briefed on this, cyber elevated to the number 1 risk in the organization, and the security budget for the CISO doubled. And that was a pretty substantial number given that they were a Fortune 10 company. So bringing that context and getting them to understand how the risk is operationalized if the attacker is successful is much more meaningful. It also allows you to bring these level of metrics around how long it took to detect, what level of stealthiness, were you able to achieve in the organization, what controls did they have in place that they thought were going to stop some sort of lateral movement, but it didn't, and then go look at the root causes as to why that happened. Was it a tool that was, tuned down too low and the alert missed, or was tuned too high and the analyst had the alert, but they just didn't have the time or the bandwidth to get to it? So bringing that context into the equation is certainly an important part of this as well. Tools are not talent. You'll see in a lot of these lessons learned the emphasis around the human aspect of engaging in red teaming. Tools are a supplement to the actual ability for a human to replicate what an attacker would do. The tools can't replicate the decision making. I had this finding actually early in my career when I was running a red team for a coalition forces, Five Eyes, during a classified military exercise. And I had at my disposal a whole bunch of very interesting tools because I was getting stuff from the US government, I was getting stuff from the private sector, I was getting stuff from the Canadians, the Australians, the UK. And what I realized was that I could have the best arsenal in the world, but if I didn't have the talented team that was able to utilize those tools, they really were ineffective. So I've always emphasized the fact that the tools bring something to the equation, but they're not a replacement for talent itself. To that end, recognition that you actually can't script an adversary. And this doesn't mean that I don't think that automated red teaming doesn't have a role in the market. I'm an investor in Scythe that does automated red teaming. I think that there's value for that in testing for certain types of scenarios. But at the end of the day, you are dealing with a human attacker for which you cannot script what that human attacker is going to do or what decisions they're going to make faced with options as they discover the attack surface in your organization. So being overly reliant on tools that try and script something or can't bring the intent of the attacker into the equation is also a lesson learned. Again, that the tools bring some value to the equation, but you don't want to pretend that you are scripting an adversary. What nation state does Nessus represent? Or what cybercrime group does Metasploit represent? You have to be able to bring that human element to the equation. And that's because your attacker is not a 1 or a 0. And this is something I stole from my friend Jay Healy many years ago. This recognition that we tend to think of cybersecurity as a purely technical problem, when really it is a geopolitical and a human problem as well. There is a living, breathing adversary at the other end of that attack. Even if facing with an automated tool, there is somebody who wrote that tool who had some intent in some objective that they're trying to achieve. So this recognition that you can't think of cybersecurity as purely technical is an important one. And as red teamers, you need to be able to emulate that human behavior, that human decision making as part of the red teaming process. The 10th man rule, made famous by the movie World War Z. that says that you should, if you have 9 people in a room that agree to one thing, the rule of the 10th person is to take the opposite perspective. That's important in red teaming as well, because I think red teams are good at demonstrating the art of the possible, of showing what could happen to an organization, or kind of unexpected outcomes based on a human attacker focusing on the attack surface in your organization. It is also a rallying cry for building diverse teams and making sure that everyone on the team doesn't have the same experience base. I came from a DoD centric kind of heritage DNA. So when I first started red teaming in the private sector, I really didn't want people that looked or acted or had the same experience base that I did, because we wanted that diversity of talent and that diversity of perspective. So it's important that you remember and recognize that, the job is not to kind of think outside the box, but to think without the box and introduce those ideas that might be relatively disruptive to the cyber defenders as part of the red team engagement. Speak truth to power. I think this is an important skill set that has been essential, for my success in from a red teaming perspective. I have briefed heads of states to include kings. I've briefed generals and CEOs and boards of directors. And I have always taken this perspective of, I am going to tell the truth, even if it is bad news, or I am going to seek for ways to engage in useful analogies to try and portray the impact of the message that I'm trying to get across. A great example I always like to cite happened early in my career. I had just done a red team engagement of a classified network down at Special Operations Command. And if you're familiar with Special Operations Command, it's kind of, a base within a base. So fairly highly secure facility, has a culture, in of itself. And one of the things that I encountered, and this will help you understand how long ago this took place, is that the actual head of SOCOM, the general in charge of Special Operations Command, had a 1-character password. And we had discovered this during the red team engagement. And as you can imagine, the impact was pretty substantial. And I had talked with his team, and they had said, oh, the general refers to that as his 1-character password. That's his combat ready password. If he's ever in a combat situation, he doesn't want to have to remember or type out a password. He just wants to be able to hit a character and get access to the systems that he needs access to. And I had a briefing that was scheduled one-on-one with this general to brief out, and I wanted to address this issue of the 1-character password. So I go in, and I had made a couple of observations in the month that I had been working there, and I gave him the brief out from the red team engagement in general, and I said, sir, there's one issue that I'd like to address with you. And he said, what's that? I said, it's the fact that you have a 1-character password. And he's like, oh, that's my combat ready password. I need that. And I kind of looked around the room, and I said, well, we're in Florida right now. We're really not in a combat situation. Do you think it's appropriate that you maintain a combat ready password as we're sitting here at SOCOM headquarters? And he kind of blew me off, kind of gave this kind of like gruff, raised his shoulders. And then I made another point, and it was based on an observation that I had seen. When I started working at Special Operations Command, there had actually been a different commander, and I had been there during the change in command ceremonies and when the current commander had taken over. And one thing that I observed is that whether he drove himself or came with his driver, that he backed into his parking spot. And they refer to that as combat ready parking. You want to be able to jump in your vehicle, put it in drive, and pull forward. You don't want to have to go reverse and then forward. And I noticed that after he started doing that, that almost everyone in his chain of command started backing their cars into their parking spots, and they were replicating this combat ready parking. And so I said to him, I said, sir, did you notice how people started to replicate your combat ready parking in just a few weeks after you assumed command? He said, no, I didn't notice. I said, well, just about everybody are now backing into their slots. I said, how long do you think it's going to take until those in your command start to replicate this combat ready password and you introduce this real systemic risk, beyond just your account into the organization? And he sat there and looked at me for a second, and he said, all right, son, I'll change my effing password. And that was that. But it took a lot to set the frame for him to understand that not only was there real world risk associated with his behavior, but since he was setting the culture and was the established leadership in the organization, he was creating what was a really poor security culture and poor behaviors that were going to be replicated within the organization. Don't call it luck. This is one thing that I would try and mentor my red teamers to not do, where they would go through this complex, attack against an organization that would take weeks of preparation, weeks of execution. They would reach a critical point, and they would attribute it to luck. They would say, "Oh, we got here, and then this vulnerability was present, and we got really lucky." And I used to tell them, don't attribute anything to luck. The point in which you're at where you can exploit this vulnerability or you found this pathway is not luck. It's the result of actually working really hard over a period of weeks or months to accomplish your objective. And it sends the wrong message to those that you're briefing if you attribute this to luck. We're not relying on the attackers or adversary to get lucky. We are expecting them to engage in a systemic kind of prolonged campaign over a period of time, and that's what we've replicated. So making sure in your own internal messaging and when you're messaging with clients that you're not attributing what can be a lot of hard work to luck. You engaged in behaviors, you made decisions, you exploited systems that got you to that point in time that allowed you to exploit that particular scenario, whatever it may be. It was not luck. It was actually hard work, and it was actually a determined engagement as a red teamer. And this kind of flows along with the 10th man rule, and that part of the role of the red teamer is to be the black swan and raise those potentials within the organization that you're targeting for attacks that maybe they haven't conceived or for attacker behavior that they haven't anticipated. So again, as I'd mentioned, the job here is not just to think outside the box, but to think without the box and try and focus on, okay, if I was really trying to be disruptive, if I was really trying to be innovative as an attacker, what would I do? I used to tell a team at Fusion X, after we would work with a client for a number of years and their security posture looked really robust and it was hard to break in, I would say, our job is to out innovate the attacker. Our client has gotten to a certain level of security where these common tactics are not going to work, but we know that there are determined attackers that are going to continue to go after them. How does that attacker need to innovate in order to accomplish their objective? What will they do next, anticipated or unanticipated? And that's what we should be trying to predict. And that is the behavior that we should be bringing into our red teams in order to elevate even further the client's security posture, that we can identify those attack surfaces that maybe are novel or those techniques that might be new or unanticipated and help the client get experience in facing those and in remediating those issues prior to a real attacker taking them on. So this remembrance that part of your job, especially for mature red teams working with mature clients, is to seek out those pathways of innovation and determine what would an attacker do next, what would they have to do next, and how do we replicate that. So I want to shift a little bit because I know we've got a mixed audience of people with all different experience in the crowd, including on the cyber defense side, and talk about what are some of these lessons learned over the past 25 years that are applicable on the cyber defense side of the equation. The first is this recognition that technology has inherent risk. I love this quote that the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. We are trying to realize as an organization in which the cyber defenders exist within that organization, we are trying to realize the benefits of all these technologies while managing the risk. And I've heard that theme multiple times throughout the day today, in that cyber risk is a risk that can be managed within a business like other risks. And that's the approach that we need to be thinking through. And we want to make sure that we're able to enable technology within the business. You certainly don't want security to be an inhibitor to what the business is trying to accomplish. You want the security team to be an enabler within the organization so that they can take advantage of those technology developments, of the platforms that they're trying to deploy, of the solutions that they're trying to bring to the market, but in the most reasonably risk managed way that you can. Also, the understanding from a cyber defense perspective that there are attackers out there that are operating with a longer term perspective than any red team engagement is going to provide. We obviously need to time scope our red teaming engagements from a cost perspective, just from a deployment of resources perspective. We need to provide some of those constraints, but the recognition that at the national strategic level, there are attackers, there are nation state adversaries that are going to engage in penetration of networks and systems for future exploitation, that they are trying to establish a foothold in your organization and play the long game. And the recognition that the attacks, that they generate, or the behavior that they exhibit on the network is going to be different than what you experience through normal attackers or even as part of these red teaming engagements. What do I mean by that? A great example I like to provide is perhaps you are the president prior to World War II, and your national security advisor comes up and says, hey, Mr. or Mrs. President, we believe we're going to be drawn into conflict with the Germans, and we have a plan. We're going to go and plant explosives at their ball bearing manufacturing plants. And we know we can do this without detection. You don't ever have to push the button to blow up the plants. But if we do wind up in conflict and you do decide to push the button, it will provide for great strategic advantage because it'll diminish their war making capabilities, and it will save American and allied lives. So do you put the explosives in the ball bearing plants? Any sort of national security realist is going to say, yes, I can do it without attribution. I'd never have to use that capability, and it'll provide me with great strategic advantage. Now, shift that perspective into the cyber domain, where you have nation states who can foresee a potential pathway 5 to 10 years in the future, where perhaps engaging in some sort of cyber attack against critical infrastructure in the United States will provide them with great strategic advantage. And now rewind to today from 10 years out and think through, what would that attacker need to accomplish in order for those future attacks to be successful? And think about what that means from a network security and attack surface perspective. This is what we call, or what I refer to as, time-shifted intent. We always think about cyber defense as the attacker has current intent to achieve an objective on our network. And we need to remember that the attackers can also shift their intent to the future, that they might engage in behavior that sets the stage for future types of attacks, but they don't actually operationalize the attack today. Targeting trust. My colleague Neil Pollard and Brian Houghton and I wrote a paper back in 1996 called Information Terrorism, Can You Trust Your Toaster? And it's been a lot of fun over the years to revisit that paper and look at all the things that we got right. And we got quite a bit right, with regards to what we were able to predict from an emerging threat landscape and even an emerging technology landscape. But we also asked ourselves the question, what did we get wrong? When we were thinking about cyber security, cyber terrorism back in 1996, what has actually happened today that was impossible for us to anticipate? And the number one finding that we had was that adversaries can target trust the same way that they can target systems, and that has been a component of their behavior, at least over the past 6, 7, perhaps even longer years. And what do we mean by targeting trust? For example, the institutions of elections are a trusted institution. We expect them to be fair. We expect them to be secure. An attacker does not need to go in and change votes as part of, a compromise of an electronic voting machine. All they need to do is convince a segment of the population that that was possible, and create it so that that institution of elections becomes less trusted, or it becomes something where the integrity of that institution comes into question. If you start to think about your organization or critical infrastructures, you can start to pull on these threads of, if an attacker were trying to diminish trust in our organization, trust from a customer perspective, trust from a partner perspective, trust from a public equities perspective. What would they do? And incorporate that into your thinking around cyber defense, because we've seen these cyber attacks used as an engagement, not just for targeting systems, but for targeting trust as well. Incorporate security into the design process. This seems like a no-brainer, but I tell you, I just encounter again and again and again all of these initiatives, including some just in the past year, where hundreds of millions has been spent on the design and development of some sort of new product or solution, and security did not have a seat at the table. So you need to make sure that security is part of the design process. There's a story I like to tell around a red team engagement that we did for a commercial satellite communication provider. And it was interesting in that they had issued an RFP for this engagement to take place. We had responded to the RFP. We went in and did orals as one of 3 finalists that were selected. We were ultimately awarded the contract. We came in and did a kickoff briefing with the client. We walked away with 800 pages of documentation about the satellite system, went back to our offices, came back, like 10 to 14 days later and said, okay, we're ready to get access to the system in your lab environment. How do we facilitate that? And the client said, what do you mean get access to it in the lab environment? I said, well, you hired us to do a red team of this satellite platform, and now we want to actually bang on it. We want to put, some keys on some hands on keyboards. I said, no, we don't have it in a lab. This satellite is actually in space already. So we had gone through this whole process of thinking about red teaming in the context of this satellite solution, where the client was trying to red team it while it was in space, and we were trying to red team it before it was launched. And I had to explain to them that the impact that we could have from a red teaming perspective was significantly diminished by the fact that the platform was already in space. So it became, years later, a kind of laughable type incident, but it is something that we see occurring over and over and over again. Steve Lukasik, who is the director of DARPA when DARPANET was started, DARPANET, was a good friend. Would participate in actually several red teams that were non-cyber red teams together, and was hosting him over at the house for a barbecue over a beer. And he sat down and said, Matt, had we known that the internet was going to be the backbone of finance and culture and communications and just such an important technology, we would have thought about security. He's like, but we weren't thinking about security. That wasn't what we were creating. So now we're having to live with this kind of retrofit over time. How often do we need to relive that mistake? I think as we saw the emergence of IoT platforms, not a lot of consideration was given to security, even though we knew that these devices were going to go in all of our homes. Every organization that's a Fortune 500 organization that I've interacted with over the past couple of years has some sort of machine learning, data science, artificial intelligence initiative. Yet how many are thinking through the security implications of those initiatives and making sure that the platforms that they're deploying are drawing on the lessons learned? Or even something as simple as the Web3 movement, or what we see in the cryptocurrency, blockchain / NFT space, where there's this great rush to drive innovation, drive wealth and value creation, but very little effort put towards thinking through the security components of that in advance. So making sure that you build security into the design process is probably one of the most fundamental lessons that we can draw from this. Also, the recognition that security and IT are interlinked. And I know that we'd like to divide them up and think, well, the CTO is over here and the CISO is over there. But they are commingled and dependent on each other. And there are some things that the IT group can do that can greatly improve the security of the organization. There's, for example, another CEO that I sat down with when we talk about kind of speaking the truth to power. And we had been doing an engagement. This is a publicly traded company, large, brand that you would recognize. It's been around for a long time. And we had criticized them about the lack of spending in the organization on initiatives that would actually improve their security. And I was sitting with the CEO, and he looked at me and said, Matt, aren't you proud of me? I just approved the $3 million, I think it was, to deploy this network intrusion detection system that's going to help us detect cyber attacks. I'm spending money on security. Aren't you happy? And I kind of looked at him and said, "Yes, sir, I'm happy that you're thinking about spending money on security, but what you've done is you've installed the equivalent of a smoke detector in an elementary school where every kid has a book of matches." Because what I've seen you do over the past couple of years is not fund the initiative to move your desktop environment away from Windows XP with local admin. And I think that you'll get much more value from a security investment perspective if you make some investments in your IT infrastructure that would greatly contribute to the security of the organization versus, buying the sexy tool that you heard about at a conference. So it was an interesting conversation, but a further demonstration that security and IT are interlinked, and you need to be viewing your IT spending from a security value perspective as well. This for me is a great little exercise. You can go find it on the internet, though you'll have to try it on a friend because I'm about to give it away. This is a study where people were shown a video and they were asked to count how many times the people with white t-shirts passed the basketball amongst themselves. So you go focus watching this video and you're counting how many times does a basketball get passed from somebody wearing a white t-shirt to somebody else wearing a white t-shirt. And I think the appropriate answer is like 14. But in the middle of the video, a person in a gorilla suit walks into frame, bangs their hands on their chest, and walks out of frame. And at the end of the video watching, when they would ask the participants, "Hey, how many times did they pass the basketball?" They would give a response. Then they would say, "Okay, did you see the gorilla?" And 50% of the participants would not see the gorilla. This, I think, for me, is a perfect analogy for this problem that we have with regards to SOC analysts putting eyes on glass in a traditional alerting environment. It is important, obviously, that we want to run signature-based detection and other detection capabilities and provide some sort of alerting and some sort of resolution of those alerting. But we also need to be engaging in threat hunting. We need to be thinking like the attacker from a cyber defense perspective and think, if an attacker has already compromised this network, where would they hide? What would they do? Can I go find IOCs that are kind of non-signature based or unexpected in their environments, and making sure that we're not just conditioning people to close out alerts on a daily basis. No plan survives contact with the enemy, or I feel like Mike Tyson said it better, everybody has a plan till they get punched in the mouth, is why we engage in red teaming in the first place. We have security aspirations inside the organization. We have technologies that we've deployed, but we need somebody that can be the honest broker and test that actual implementation, making sure that our aspirations are actually matched with the implementation of those technologies. I like to use this analogy with Mike Tyson because if you had to fight Mike Tyson, would you want to train just using a static punching bag, or would you want to actually train with a sparring partner who could replicate what a human attacker can do in the boxing ring? And I think we would all want to have the sparring partner instead of the static punching bag. And what red teaming does is it brings that perspective to the equation. It's the friendly sparring partner, and thus a very valuable part of anything that we do. And it's to address these security realities. I love this slide because it demonstrates from a red teaming perspective a very significant weakness in the deployment of this chain link with padlock to close this gate. Yet from an operational perspective, people were going in and out of this gate, unlocking and locking the padlock, despite this kind of security theater component with regards to it being obvious that there was this vulnerability that existed in how they had implemented security around this particular facility. The role of red teaming is to find those anomalies that exist in the enterprise and make sure that you can action them, that you can actually remediate them and address these security realities before a real attacker does. Confronting the gray rhinos. If I had a nickel for every organization that said, well, we wouldn't have gotten hacked if we had just deployed our multi-factor authentication, or if we had just done that, it is as if the plan for what they needed to do was sitting there right in front of them, and they did not action it. They did not confront the obvious in their organization. The Grey Rhino reference is from a great book that I read last year, in which we understand black swans being kind of the things that we can't anticipate. But Michelle Walker, in her book, The Grey Rhino, actually talks about how we typically will turn away from risks that we are confronting face on. The gray elephant is there. It represents a threat. We know that it's there, yet we ignore it or we don't engage in the behaviors that would reduce our risk. So another key challenge is to make sure that you don't get stuck in perpetual planning mode, that you're actually focused on operationalizing those security measures that you know are going to be high value within the organization. And lastly, another one that seems rather obvious, but I have to constantly restate for cyber defense teams, is that every cyber attacker is an insider. Given appropriate time, I don't know, any of the top 10 red team organizations that wouldn't establish some sort of foothold inside the network that you cherish most. So thinking through, what does your cyber defense look like if the attacker is already on the inside? When I helped the Department of Defense write the cyber strategy in 2010, this presumption of breach component of it was a hill that I was willing to die on. I wanted them to understand, how do you think about security if the attacker is already inside the network? How do you determine, where they're going? How do you maintain your operational capability despite the fact that you have a breach or an attacker living on the network? That reframes security in a really interesting way. If you no longer can assume that you've kept the attacker out, but that they're living with you on those systems that you cherish most, now what do you do about it? Now how do you recover or demonstrate the resiliency where you're still able to engage in your mission parameters despite the fact that you've got an active attacker? So this recognition that you can't just take a perimeter-based cyber defense perspective, that you have to think about the attacker being successful, and then if they're successful, if they've established that foothold, then what does your security look like? And then learn from failures. I'm an avid reader. For those that follow me, you'll know that I read about 100 books a year and produce a top 10 list every year. And those are easily searchable on the internet. If you just search for OODA Loop top 10 books, I've done it for the past 6 years. One of my favorites from a few years ago was called Black Box Thinking. And it talked about the distinction between organizations that learn from failures and those that don't. And it looked at two particular industries, one being the commercial aviation industry, the other being the medical industry, specifically hospital systems. And there was this drastic distinction between those two organizations' ability or desire to learn from past failures. And I don't want to give away, the tenets of the book, but I would highly recommend it. But at the end of the day, it made me, feel very comfortable flying and very uncomfortable going to a hospital. So you want to develop an organization that's able to learn not only from your failures, but from the failures of others in your industry. And then prepare for exponential disruption. My colleague Bob Gorley talked today about security and risk in the metaverse. Understanding that things over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, are going to be significantly disrupted, and that you're building a security organization that is going to be able to handle that exponential disruption, that you're going to have that agility to to pivot or address new risks that are emerging on the landscape. And that's all I had by way of kind of formal slides. I will F3 my way back over so that I can participate in the chat and any questions that might be there. All right. Thank you, William. So Brian, have you used Mitre Attack to identify TTPs, emulate various adversaries? What do you think about this approach? I think Mitre Attack is great. I think it provides a framework, especially for early red teaming engagements, to emulate an attacker behavior and kind of the pathways that they might follow in order to achieve their objective. It's not a replacement, I don't think, over time, for being able to emulate a human attacker and the human decision-making process. But it is a great way for organizations to think through, okay, how does this map to my organization? If an attacker is going to follow these particular pathways, or this particular ATP typically follows this attack pathway, how does that map to my organization? Do I have those technologies deployed? Do I have the controls in place? Do I have overlapping controls? Do I have control deficiencies? That's one of those areas. Do I have critical controls? I love red teams that are designed to go and exercise what have been identified through Mitre Attack as critical controls to make sure that those controls actually exist and are implemented properly. So big fan of Mitre Attack. I think it gives us all a great framework, and I love the work that they're doing that maps actual adversary behavior into the Mitre Attack framework, because it gives red teams a great starting point to say, well, we want to emulate this particular attacker. How have they attacked in the past? Let's use that as the basis for what we do. So systemic risk communication model that has worked best for you when working with boards. I think I touched on that a little bit with regards to um, being able to develop useful analogies and contextualizing the organizational impact. And that varies from organization to organization. I haven't seen a lot of boards that get involved at kind of the NISC framework level. They might get briefed, with regards to applicable standards, depending on the type of organization that they're at. Their real focus is trying to understand what is the risk to our organization. Uh, who is targeting us, what would they do, and how well are we able to defend against it. And also we've added that metric of, how well are they able to detect when an attack is successful. So the most useful conversations I've had at the board and executive level has been those contextual ones that help them identify, the real operational risks, the investments that they're making, the value they're getting from those investments, and tracking real security metrics. If you can go to a board. And we did this at Fusion X with some of the clients that we worked with, because our model was a multi-year engagement model. It wasn't just a one and done red team, where we could go and say, okay, when we started with your organization, we typically would, obtain some sort of, critical foothold in the organization that allowed us to pivot and achieve our objective within X number of days. Let's call it, it took us 7 days. And we went undetected by the organization for 30 days. And we had to elevate our level of activity to actually be detected. And then 3 years later, when we come in and we say, okay, now we've kind of flipped that. It took us 30 days to establish a foothold. So from an attacker perspective, they had to make a relatively large investment. And then once we established that foothold, we were detected within a day. And we weren't able to achieve our objective because they discovered us and kind of got us off the network. That to me is a real demonstration around the efficacy of the security program that they've deployed in the organization. If they can string a narrative like that together that shows that they are actually able to make themselves a harder target, not that that an attacker won't be successful at some point, but that also once that attacker has gotten that initial compromise, that they're able to detect them in a reasonable time. I would also add to that the efficiency of the response. We want to make sure that once they identify the attacker, that they've got a kind of whole of system approach, that they're not doing something silly like saying, oh, they got malware on our internal network and it was communicating out through command and control. So all we did was block the egress IP addresses and they can't communicate out, but we didn't go wipe the malware. So we'll also look at factors like that to make sure that they're taking a holistic type viewpoint. So, reading William's question, are you seeing the same sort of principles around profit over security and safety? I certainly think that we are. There's no doubt that the market rewards those that are able to get to the market the quickest. That that are trying to drive kind of key innovation, key developments, and I think that we do that at the sacrifice of security. So I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily that the organizations don't want to invest in security. I think that it's that they view security as slowing down progress and preventing them to from getting to market in a certain time frame. So maybe they're willing to absorb the fiat costs of implementing security, but they're not willing to absorb the time delays associated with legitimately thinking about security. So I worry about the deployment in development of new technologies, as I mentioned, without building security into that design process. I think we're making some really fatal mistakes in the AI domain. Uh, and that's an area where, when you think about machine learning, I like to explain it as, with machine learning, you have risks based on bad training data, bad algorithms, especially for unsupervised machine learning, where the humans kind of lose the loop on how the system is evolving, where it is like compounding interest in a bank account, where the risk or the impact of that bad training data, those bad algorithms, compounds over time. So the earlier that you can address that in the equation, the better. I don't see anybody doing it. I've talked with organizations. I've tried to be an advocate for it, and they start arguing, well, does that come out of the CTO's budget or the CISO's budget, or how do we address that? So we're continuing to make mistakes around innovative technologies by not addressing security.